The wind at my father's grave was cruel enough to cut through wool, but nothing cut deeper than my own brother's hand closing around my arm and dragging me away from the crowd like I was something to be swept off the floor. He told everyone I was making a scene, that I'd come to beg. I didn't fight him. I didn't scream. I let him walk me all the way to the iron gate, because I already knew what happens to a woman who raises her voice in a room full of people who've already decided she's nothing. What none of them knew, not my brother, not his wife counting the guests like invoices, not the family lawyer already dividing up the company in his head, was that the wooden box they'd shoved into my arms to get rid of me was about to bring a stranger's black car up that gravel driveway, and the single piece of paper he was carrying would silence that entire tent. Before we go further, if stories like this move you, hit subscribe now. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story about inheritance. It's about every person who was ever told their hands weren't good enough to matter. My name is Adeline Marrow, and I buried my father with sawdust still under my fingernails. I'd been awake since for that morning, finishing a wedding suit for a client who needed it by Monday. Grief doesn't pause the world. It just makes your hands move slower while your heart falls apart. The Whitfield estate sat almost an hour outside the city, past the old brick mill where my father built an empire out of nothing but one loom and 40 years of sleepless nights. When I arrived, the driveway told me everything I needed to know. Luxury cars lined up like a shareholder meeting had broken out around a coffin. My brother had even hired a valet for a funeral. I parked my old pickup truck at the far end, where it wouldn't embarrass anyone, and I walked in alone. People who hadn't spoken to me in years turned to look, then quickly looked away. The way you glance at a stain on the carpet, hoping someone else will deal with it. My sister-in-law, Camille, found me first. She air-kissed beside my cheek, careful not to actually touch me. Then her eyes dropped to my hands, the small burn scar from the iron, the calloused fingertips, and something in her expression shut like a door closing. "You could have at least gotten a manicure," she whispered. "For your father." I looked down at my own hands. 40 years of my father's legacy had been built by hands exactly like mine. And not one person standing in that yard could see it. She steered me toward the back row, the seats reserved, apparently, for the family's disappointments. You have to understand what it meant, growing up, to be the Whitfield who worked with her hands instead of her mouth. My father measured people the way he measured fabric, by what they produced. My brother, Weston, produced contracts. I produced stitched hems. I still remember being 9 years old, showing him a seam I'd repaired on his old work coat, so proud of how invisible the stitch was. He turned it inside out, checked the tension, and said, "Every business needs someone who knows how to fix what everyone else breaks." For 27 years I carried that sentence like an insult. The fixer. Not the builder. Not the leader. Just the one you keep around in case something tears. My mother died when I was 12, and after that the house grew quieter while the ledgers grew louder. Weston went to business school. I went to the workroom, because a straight seam never once told me I was a failure. By 21 I'd opened my own small tailoring shop, with my name on nothing but the receipts. My father never once visited in 15 years. We spoke twice a year, in sentences short enough to fit on an invoice. And now he was in the ground, and I was standing in the back row of his funeral holding a sentence I still didn't understand. Someone who knows how to fix what everyone else breaks. I had no idea yet that he'd spent his final 2 years proving he meant every word of it, and that he'd hidden the proof inside a box of old sewing tools. My brother ran that funeral the way he ran every meeting of his life, like a deal he'd already won. Charcoal suit, practiced handshakes, condolences that sounded suspiciously like congratulations. "The company's in good hands now," one investor murmured to him. Weston didn't correct him. Camille had made seating cards. For a funeral. The buyers sat up front. The people who'd actually loved our father sat toward the back, because grief, apparently, had no purchasing department. I watched my brother rest his hand on the casket for a photographer he'd clearly hired in advance, and I understood, this wasn't the end of our father to him. This was the beginning of Weston. He caught me watching. For a flicker of a second, I saw the boy who used to sneak me cookies after our father worked too late. Then it vanished, replaced by the same scanning look Camille had given me. The truck. The calluses. The coat I'd sewn myself because I couldn't justify buying one. Not here, his eyes said. Not you. Not today. Near the tent, the family lawyer arrived before the service even ended, a leather folder tucked under his arm. He hadn't come to mourn. He'd come to read. And when Weston saw him, my brother finally smiled, a wide, hungry smile. The smile of a man who'd been waiting a long time for a piece of paper to make official what he'd always assumed was already his. They read the will in the front parlor, beneath a portrait of my father that made him look far gentler than he ever was. Weston sat like the chair was already his throne. I stood in the doorway, because there wasn't a seat left for me, and no one had thought to offer one. The estate, Weston. The accounts, Weston and Camille. Controlling interest in Whitfield Textiles, Weston. 40 years of my father's life, flowing in dry legal language straight toward my brother. When my name finally came up, the lawyer paused, just slightly. To my daughter, Adeline. I leave the contents of my sewing chest. That was the entire line. Somewhere behind me, a cousin laughed, a short, ugly bark he tried too late to swallow. My brother looked at me across the room, and it wasn't cruelty on his face. It was relief. The math had finally landed the way he'd always assumed it would. Well, Weston said, spreading his hands to the room, magnanimous in victory. At least Dad kept his sense of humor to the end. The room laughed freely, because he'd given them permission. I didn't laugh. I didn't cry. I just thought, a box of thread. After everything. I had no idea that in that moment, my father had handed me the entire company, and every person in that room had mistaken it for a joke. They carried the chest in like leftovers from a party, scarred oak, brass latch gone green with age, smelling of beeswax and cedar. The smell of the workroom I used to hide in as a little girl. Camille appeared instantly at my shoulder. You'll want to take that today, she said. We're having people over next week. Honestly, Adeline, we need to start clearing out the clutter. Clutter. My father's tools. The one thing he'd chosen to leave me, and she'd already filed it under garbage. As I lifted the chest to leave, the lid shifted, and through the gap I saw the corner of something that didn't belong among the spools and thimbles. Paper. Old, heavy, folded, tucked down against the felt lining. I almost stopped to look right there. But Weston was watching, and I had learned long ago, the fastest way out of a room that doesn't want you is to give it nothing to remember. I made it 4 steps before my brother decided even my leaving was somehow wrong. Adeline. His voice carried, pitched for the room. He crossed to me, lowering his tone, though not nearly enough. You are not going to make a scene. There are people here who matter to this company, and I won't have them watching my sister sulk through our father's funeral. I'm carrying a box to my truck, I said. You're carrying a look, he said, like the look itself were the crime. I'll be gone in 5 minutes, I told him, and turned for the door. That should have been the end of it. But my brother had spent the entire day being congratulated for an empire, and somewhere in all that flattery, he forgot the one lesson our father actually lived by. Know when you've already won, and let it go. Instead, his hand closed around my elbow. And in front of the investors, the cousins, the lawyer still packing his folder, Weston walked me toward the front doors like a problem being escorted off the premises. I could have pulled away. I'm stronger than I look. You don't press wool for 20 years with soft arms. But I saw phones lifting halfway, saw the buyers turning to watch, and understood the trap instantly. Fight back, and I'm hysterical. Cry, and I'm pathetic. Let him walk me out with my chin level and the box in my arms, and I'm the only thing left they can't take from me. So I let him steer me. As we passed the cluster of important faces, he said it, warm, sorrowful, perfectly pitched for an audience. I'm so sorry about this, he told them, tilting his head toward me with a sad little laugh. She was practically begging at Dad's funeral. It's been hard on her. Begging. I hadn't asked a single person for anything, but the word landed in that room like a verdict, and I watched every face rearrange itself into sympathy, for him. Poor Weston. Saddled with a sister like that. He walked me down the steps, into wind that had teeth, all the way to the gate, and let go of my arm on the public side of the iron, brushing his palm against his trousers afterward, as if he'd touched something that might leave a stain. Then he walked back up the drive without a word. I stood alone on the road, holding my father's tools, watching my family through the bars of a gate I'd been born on the wrong side of. I could hear the laughter carrying on the wind. Thin. Bright. Already forgetting I'd ever been there at all. That's the part that breaks you, not the cruelty. Cruelty at least means someone's thinking about you. It was the ease of it. How quickly the water closed over the space where I used to stand. I set the chest down on the gravel shoulder, pressed my cold hands flat against the lid, and told myself, open it at home. Not here. Not with the gate watching. Then I heard it. Under the wind. The low, expensive hum of an engine that didn't belong on that road. The car was black, old model. The kind of expensive that doesn't try to prove anything. It rolled to a stop a few feet away, and a man stepped out, 70, maybe older, wearing a well-cut gray coat, looking at me the way you look at someone you drove a long way to find. Adeline Whitfield, he said. Behind me, through the gate, the funeral carried on without me. Glasses clinking, laughter rising, the quiet machinery of a family congratulating itself. The man glanced once toward the tent, toward my brother holding court over a company he assumed was finally his. Something in his expression went flat and cold and certain. Then he reached into his coat, drew out a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored paper, folded once, and held it up so I could see it. He didn't raise his voice. Chairwoman, he said. I want to be honest. My first thought wasn't triumph. It was that grief had finally cracked something loose in my mind, and I was hearing things that weren't real. I'm sorry, I said. Who are you? Julian Cole, he said, as though the name should mean something. When it didn't, something in his face softened. Your father and I built that company 40 years ago. Before your brother. Before any of this. He nodded toward the paper. This is a stock certificate. Founders' voting shares. Your father signed them into your name 2 years ago and asked me to hold them until today, after the will was read. After you'd seen exactly how they'd treat you when they believed you had nothing. I looked at my father's signature. The same cramped handwriting that had signed my report cards without ever reading them. The sewing chest, I said slowly. The original certificates inside, Julian said. He knew you'd be the only one willing to open a box of old thread. I stood on that road, my inheritance at my feet, and behind the gate my brother laughed at something. And for the first time all day, the wind stopped mattering. Come with me to the offices, Julian said. There are things you need to understand before you decide anything. I looked back at the gate one last time. Then I picked up the chest, and I got in the car. The company offices sat 2 miles away, a low brick building my father had purchased when I was still in high school. Julian drove me there in a silence that felt, strangely, like respect. Inside, a lawyer named Priyanka spread 3 documents across a long walnut table and explained it in plain words, because she could see I needed them plain. A privately held company can issue more than one class of stock, she said. Your father structured Whitfield Textiles that way from the very beginning. There's common stock. That's what your brother inherited. The bulk of the equity, the dividends, the paper value. And then there's a founders class. Very few shares. They pay almost nothing. She tapped the certificate. But whoever holds them controls the board. Controls who runs the company. Every major decision. It isn't 51% of the money, Adeline. It's 51% of the votes that actually matter. I sat with that. All day I had watched my brother accept a company as his birthright. Watched him escort me to a gate to protect his image. And the entire time, the real empire had already been signed quietly into a box of thread with my name on it. He doesn't know, I said. Not yet, Priyanka answered. And right on cue, the door swung open, and my brother stood there, tie loosened, color high, having driven straight from the funeral the moment someone told him his sister had walked into his building and sat down at the head of his table. He laughed, not cruelly, just genuinely baffled. What is this? What are you doing, Adeline? This is my boardroom, as of this morning. As of this morning, Priyanka said quietly, it's hers. His eyes dropped to the certificate. I watched him read it twice, hunting for the mistake, the loophole, the crack that would put the world back where it belonged. There wasn't one. This is a mistake, he said, voice changing. Dad wouldn't. He knew what I built here. He knew, Julian said simply, and left the sentence there, because some things are heavier unfinished. Weston looked at me, really looked, for the first time in years, trying to match the sister he'd walked out of a funeral an hour earlier to the woman now sitting in the chair he'd expected to be his. I'm calling my own lawyer, he said, and walked out. I let him. I already knew what that lawyer would tell him that my brother moved fast. Within a week, calls had gone out to buyers, to suppliers, to two of the company's biggest accounts. Nothing you could put in writing. Just a whisper here, a raised eyebrow there. My sister's lovely, he told them. But she runs a little alteration shop. Sweet work. Running a company this size is different. He let the sentence hang. And people always finish those sentences the cruelest way. My own small business, the one thing that had never depended on the Whitfield name, suddenly found its supply contract terminated over conflict of interest. My cloth costs jumped overnight. A supplier I called for years turned suddenly apologetic. We value the Whitfield relationship, he said, meaning Weston. My brother had found the one pressure point that had nothing to do with boardrooms. He couldn't touch my shares, so he reached around them and pressed his thumb directly on my livelihood. I sat with my ledgers bleeding red, and something ugly in me finally sat upright and spoke. You have the votes. You could end him tonight. And I could have. I actually opened my laptop. I actually began drafting the resolution, his removal, his public exposure, every word he'd whispered about his unstable sister laid bare in front of the same buyers who'd once shaken his hand. My finger hovered over save. It felt good. God help me, it felt like justice. What stopped me wasn't mercy. It was a woman named Mabel. I'd visited the old textile floor that same week, the one my father had quietly kept running at a loss out of loyalty, the one any responsible board would cut first. I found Mabel there, gray hair pinned back, hand finishing a seam almost no one under 50 still knew how to sew. I'd watched her patiently guide a shaking, nervous apprentice through his ruined stitches without a hint of anger. Everybody breaks the first 10, she told him. The trade isn't the 10 you ruin. It's whether you sit back down at the machine after. Later, alone, her words came back to me with my thumb hovering over that button. You can tell everything about a person, she'd said, by how they treat the one who's still learning, the one who can't hurt them back. I closed the laptop. That night, my sister-in-law Camille showed up at my actual shop, a place no one in that family had ever once bothered to visit. She looked exhausted, stripped of her usual polish. He doesn't know I'm here, she started, and then told me the truth she'd been performing over for years. They were in debt. Real debt. The house leveraged twice, the cars leased, an entire life balanced on the assumption that Weston would inherit everything. Our son's school called, she said, voice cracking. We're behind. He keeps asking if he did something wrong. She looked at me. You think you're the only one Dad measured? Weston's been trying to be enough for a dead man since he was 10 years old. It didn't excuse the gate. Nothing excused the gate. But it complicated the clean, satisfying anger I'd been carrying. That same week, Julian finally handed me the letter my father had asked him to hold. Until, as Julian put it, you stop trying to win, and start trying to figure out what's right. I opened it alone. My father hadn't apologized the way I'd hoped. That wasn't him, even on paper. But he'd told the truth. I measured you both your whole life with a ruler I inherited from my own father, and never once questioned it. I taught you both that the one who builds is worth more than the one who mends. I was wrong. It took me until I was an old man, sitting in your shop, watching your hands do the one thing I loved most in this world, to see it clearly. I'm not leaving you a company, Adeline. Weston can have the money. Money was never the part that mattered. I'm leaving you the say, because you're the only one of us who might finally set the ruler down. Don't punish your brother. He's already been punished his whole life by the same thing that punished you. Fix the ruler. That's the only inheritance worth anything. I read it 3 times. The sentence I'd carried as an insult since I was 9 years old finally turned over in my hands and showed me its other side. He hadn't been ranking me beneath my brother. He'd been telling me, 30 years too early. Exactly what I was for. I called a full board meeting. And I did something no chairwoman is supposed to do. I invited the floor. Mabel, the nervous apprentice. 2 of the presses from the old textile plant that closing would have destroyed. I wanted the people whose lives were being decided sitting in the very room where the deciding happened, because my father's company had spent 40 years making choices about hands in rooms where no calloused hand was ever allowed a seat. I placed my father's sewing chest in the center of that long walnut table, between the investors on one side and the workers on the other. I stood, and I told them exactly what power I held, that I could remove my brother that morning, close the plant that afternoon, expose everything he'd whispered about me to every buyer he'd whispered it to. That there wasn't a single person in that room who could stop me. I watched half the table lean in, hungry for the blade to fall. Then I set the pen down. I'm not going to do any of that, I said. My brother's face came apart in front of everyone. Why? He asked, voice cracking. You have it. All of it. I walked you to a gate. I called you a beggar in front of everyone I know. You could end me right now. So why won't you? Because this, I said, lifting the certificate, was never the weapon everyone assumed it was. That's the whole ruler our father built, and I'm done using it. The plant stayed open. All 120 jobs. My brother kept his seat too, not running operations the way he had been, but working, genuinely, under a board that finally measured this company by something other than how cheaply you could hide the seams. And I took the money he'd once offered to buy my silence and built a trust in my father's name. Apprenticeships, wages, a way to keep the old trade alive in hands like Mabel's before it disappeared with her generation. Nobody clapped. That's the part one remember most. Real dignity doesn't sound like triumph. It sounds like silence, the heavy kind that falls when people are quietly rearranging something large inside themselves. My brother didn't fall to his knees and beg forgiveness. People shaped that early by a ruler like ours don't unlearn it in a single afternoon. But he crossed that room the long way, past every machinist, and said my full name for the first time in years. I don't understand you, he admitted, quiet, just for me. I know, I said. You were taught not to. He took a working seat at that table, not banished, not enthroned. Just a man, finally, setting down a ruler he'd been gripping so long his fingers had grown around it. Months later, the trade school my father's name now funds has its first class of apprentices. Mabel runs it, ferociously. The mill kept his name over the door, exactly the way he built it. My brother and I aren't close. But he calls sometimes now, and he uses my whole name. Last spring he asked me, gruffly, almost embarrassed, to teach his son a hand stitch. The boy is 10. His seams wander. His tension is a mess. But he sits back down at the machine every single time. And when he held up his first crooked, uneven buttonhole and asked me if it was any good, I turned it inside out, the way my father once did to me. Then I did the thing my father never could. It's yours, I told him. You made it with your own hands. That makes it worth more than anything with someone else's name stitched inside. I still work at my machine most days. People expect the woman who controls a company to sit behind a glass office with a view. Instead, I have a chair with the stuffing coming loose in one arm, and my father's shears still sharp on the bench beside me. The room hasn't changed. Only I have. It used to be where I hid. Now it's where I finally get to be seen. The most expensive thing a person can ever own is the willingness to see someone clearly. My father learned that lesson too late to ever say it out loud. I nearly missed it too, standing at that gate in the wind, mistaking his last gift to me for a cruel little joke. If you made it all the way here, you already know exactly what it costs to be underestimated, and what it costs, when you finally get the power, not to become the person who underestimated you. By the way, where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel around the world.